So, where are we going? Yukimaru gave Isshin a sideways glance, twitching minutely when Isshin didn't answer. His original plan had been to wander around Rukia until he found a district that he liked. District 78 would be nice. That Zaraki guy was from 80, and he didn't feel like running into that madman yet. At least, not when he didn't even have a Zanpakuto. He loved a good fight as much as the next Arankar, but he wasn't suicidal. However, Isshin seemed to already have a destination in mind. Goatface never failed to be annoying even when he wasn't trying, Yukimaru lamented in his mind. You'll see, Isshin replied cryptically. He wasn't going to call the man Oto-chan no matter how much he whined about them being one big happy family now. And Ichigo, no, wait, it was Suzuki now, wasn't it, had always backed him up wholeheartedly on this, usually with a well-aimed kick to the face. Yukimaru closed his eyes briefly, reining in the urge to just take off on his own. Goatface was probably waiting for him to do precisely that, so that he could be hauled back like some disobedient child. Although, he couldn't help but wonder if Isshin could actually catch him, if he truly decided to make a break for it. He was, after all, a student of the goddess of Flash herself. It would probably take Sui Feng to at least stand a chance. Isshin raised a sardonic eyebrow, as if guessing his intentions. Yukimaru scowled. They had been traveling for a while now, flitting across the rooftops at a speed too high for any non-seated Shinigami to detect. To say nothing of ordinary civilians. Their respective ryatsu were suppressed to such a point that even a senior officer would have trouble sensing them. So even if there had been someone with eyes capable of following their movements, they would likely be written off as a hallucination. The imposing gates separating the districts from each other posed no trouble for them, who could clear the top of the boundary wall with a single leap. They were there to stop the civilians from mass migrating and potentially causing overpopulation in the lower districts of Rukia. A leftover relic from the first Soul King, not Shinigami. Or here, Yukimaru eyed the district number painted on the gate they had just passed. 68. Well, at least it was reasonably dangerous. He would have preferred somewhere in the 70s, but he supposed that he could always accidentally wander off after Isshin left. The boundary wall only marked the borders of the populated areas, but much of Rukia was still comprised of uncharted wilderness even back in their own time. It wasn't like the natural wildlife would be much of a threat to him. A horrible thought surfaced. Isshin wasn't taking him to a Shiba clan house, was he? He quickly shook his head. No. Even the Shiba weren't insane enough to build a branch property in a district so far out, where help would take hours or even days to arrive. He turned to Isshin, about to interrogate the other man. But his voice died in his throat at the look on the other man's face. Isshin was standing stock still, face turned towards the horizon. He didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, but his eyes were ever so slightly glazed over and the faintest shadow of a smile was tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a happy smile. Yukimaru wished that he knew what to call it, because he'd seen it before, albeit only in King's memories, on the rare occasions where the twins weren't around and King chanced upon Isshin gazing at Masaki's poster. He turned his attention to the street. There were a couple of roadside stalls, if they could even be termed as such, with hawk-eyed shopkeepers hovering over the scant few shoppers. In a district this high up, few people had the can to buy what they needed, so thieves were the rule rather than the exception. Speaking of which, come back here, you worthless rats. A trio of children raced past, an irate shopkeeper hot on their heels. Yukimaru flicked a glance at what the boy in the lead was clutching in a white-knuckled fist. Food, From his vantage point on the roof, he could see the furtive glances the others along the street were giving the quartet, but no one moved to stop anyone. It was better not to interfere, lest you get blacklisted by either the farmers or the gangs. The children rounded a corner and vanished from his sight, but their exit was immediately followed by a loud crash, and the thuds of bodies hitting the ground. Yukimaru scrambled to the edge of the roof, where he could look down and see the children in a groaning pile on the ground. The panting shopkeeper was only a few moments behind, striding up to them before they managed to untangle themselves. Pale-faced, the boy shoved the two girls behind him, turning to face the shopkeeper defiantly. I'll pay for that. Yukimaru blinked and leaned out further, catching the silhouette of a woman in the shadows under the awning of the roof he was perched on. So they hadn't tripped as he had first thought, they had run into someone. Although, that is a ridiculously generous offer, why would she do that? Maybe one of the children was hers. It's fine if I pay for them, isn't it? The shopkeeper squinted at her, but relented with a huff. That'll be 20 can. Ignoring the outraged protest, his sign said 10 can. Behind her, the woman counted several coins into the shopkeeper's hand. He frowned down at them, before pocketing the money and leaving the way he had come. The children lingered, the boy opening his mouth as if to speak. It was my fault you were caught, so I'll do it this once. His mouth snapped shut with a click audible even to Yukimaru. After a moment, he bowed respectfully at a 90-degree angle, pushing the younger girl's head down until she bowed too, while the other girl followed his lead. Then they turned and took off at a run. Thank you very much, Kurosaki-san. Wait, what? The woman left the shade of the overhang for the brightly lit street, and for a moment Yukimaru could only stare at the waterfall of reddish-brown curls cascading down her back as she walked away, the achingly familiar sight branding itself into his eyes. A hand landed on his shoulder. Yukimaru gasped, drawing in a large gulp of air. Only then did he realize his lungs were on fire, his stomach turning over as though he had eaten something bad, and for some reason he was feeling like someone had just punched him. Human emotions were so confusing. He channeled all his confusion into anger instead, because anger at least he understood. Explain. Isshin sighed, dropping down to sit on the roof with a last glance in the direction his future wife, past wife, had gone. I've told you how your mother and I met. Yukimaru gave a brusque nod. She saved you from a hollow when you were on a mission. Isshin rubbed a hand over his eyes. That wasn't the full truth. He paused for a moment, and Yukimaru had to bite his own lip to prevent his impatience from interrupting. It wasn't the first time I'd met her. Well, he corrected, technically, it was the first time that I'd met her in that life. Yukimaru decided, abruptly, that he needed to sit down too. He wished that Ichigo, Suzuki, stopped slipping up. King was having this conversation with his father, not him. You knew her before she was reincarnated as our mother, he repeated flatly. Isshin bobbed his head, eyes still far away. The story slipped out in bits and pieces, how Isshin had first met her while on his way back from a mission. How Masaki, true to the memory of her that Yukimaru possessed, had taken one look at his injuries and offered him a place to stay for a night. How Isshin had, after that, gone back again and again whenever he could find the chance, as though he were a moth drawn to her flame. I was going to ask her to take my name. The light in his eyes dimmed, then, and Yukimaru knew without asking him to elaborate how this story would end. The only way to be reincarnated, after all, was to die in soul society. That kid, he said Kurosaki-san. He seized upon the peculiarity before Isshin could do something worse, like start bawling on him. What's the chance of someone being reincarnated into the exact same family? Isshin blinked slowly at him, eyes soft with emotions Yukimaru didn't want to identify. You know that Masaki was an etched Quincy, he prompted, receiving a nod in reply. During the First Quincy War about 1,000 years ago, Shinigami scientists had observed that the offspring of two etched Quincy usually had much greater Ryatsu reserves than either of the parents. Desperate to win the war, the etched Quincy families began practicing the tradition of pure marriages, producing children with disproportionately large reserves of Ryatsu, able to stand up to even Shinigami captains. And one of them is the Kurosaki family, guessed Yukimaru. The corner of Isshin's mouth quirked up. Yes, he affirmed. To find out why, Shinigami scientists tracked the reincarnation cycles of several Quincy families, and they found something. His mouth twisted on the word, interesting. After death, a Quincy's Ryatsu is locked within the soul, such that they pass off as regular Rukengai civilians. Some may have slightly higher than average Ryatsu, but generally not enough to pass the Shinigami Academy entrance examinations, and so they go unnoticed. And when two etched Quincy have a child, the chance of this child being the reincarnation of one of their ancestors is much higher than usual. Scientists had reported seeing the same soul, over a period of several centuries, be reincarnated into the exact same family every single time. So, Yukimaru struggled to follow the logic, the idea almost too preposterous to consider. So in addition to the parent's Ryatsu, the child also inherits the latent Ryatsu reserves from a previous reincarnation. Yukimaru opened his mouth and then closed it again. It was insane. And yet, the story of how Masaki had killed White, the hollow that had grievously wounded a Shinigami captain, with a single shot. Her shooting at point blank had nothing to do with it. The 11th Division could hack away at Zaraki all day, and no one under 5th seat would be able to score a single wound on him. It took power of an equal or greater amount to actually make a spiritual being bleed. How Isshin had always said, if she hadn't lost her powers, Grand Fisher would never have been able to lay a single hand on her. The image of Ishida Ryuken amidst a sea of hollows, face utterly blank as he took down a Vasto Lord rank to Rankar by himself, something that none of the Shinigami could lay claim to. And, of course, the Wandenreich, any of whom was a match for a Shinigami captain. Take care of her for me, will you? A blink, and he found Isshin already standing, dusting himself off. Without another word, the lieutenant crouched, and then leapt off the roof, headed back the way they had come. Yukimaru turned to face the blazing afternoon sun, the gentlest of breezes brushing against his cheek. I will, Oyeji. West Rukangai District 68 was a typical cluster of hamlets of the kind seen in some of King's history textbooks about the Heian era, though those mostly focused on the imperial court and the aristocrats, and were thus of absolutely no help whatsoever to Yukimaru's current situation. It didn't take long, lurking on rooftops, to find out that newcomers to the district invariably went two ways. They were picked up by an existing household, or they ended up in one of the gangs. Rare were the special cases, those who did neither. There was one such man, boy, really, on the cusp of manhood, a few days ago, who had declared in the middle of the market square that he was a Fujiwara, and had been quickly ushered away by an officious man backed by several bodyguards. Just this morning, Yukimaru saw him leave through the gate to District 67, ensconced in a palanquin bearing the name Kano on the side. That kid's an utter idiot. What would he have done if this was a district ruled by the Taro or the Minamoto instead? The who? Honestly, Suzuki huffed a breath of laughter, flopping down on the ground and crossing his arms behind his head. You could figure out that you're in the Heian era, but you didn't remember the major clans of that era. Yukimaru gave a half shrug, mirroring Suzuki's position. How would I know that the aristocracy in the transient world would translate directly into noble clans in Seoul society? Suzuki arched an eyebrow at him. You just saw why today. Enough of those who could remember their pasts, demanding to be accorded the same luxuries as they had enjoyed in life, and you get a noble clan. Anyway, the Kano are retainers of the Fujiwara, so they've probably sent him on to the Fujiwara stronghold in District 51. It was funny. The ground should have been cold, seeing that it was made of what appeared to be obsidian. But it wasn't, not really. It pulsed internally with some unknown source of warmth. He gave the ground a suspicious look. Hopefully there wasn't a volcano buried under all that. I don't think our own mindscape can try to kill us. He scowled at the man who was supposed to be his brother now, all things considered. One day, these words will come back and bite you on the ass. King had, after all, nearly drowned in his own mindscape that one memorable time. Suzuki flapped a hand at him. Suit yourself. I'd be more worried about what's out there rather than what's in here. Not like anyone can find me, Yukimaru replied absently, propping himself up on one elbow so that he could tap the ground. There was a pregnant pause at that. Suzuki turned his head slowly to face him. Yuki, where exactly are you right now? Ono, Yukimaru scratched his head. There's a forest on the outskirts of the populated areas, and if you go in deep enough the trees are pretty big and comfortable. He trailed off at the look on Suzuki's face, at the emotions pulsing bright and clear next to him, exasperation and amusement and resignation all at once. So basically, Suzuki summarized dryly, you were so antisocial that you decided to make like Tarzan. He protested, the litany automatically falling from his lips, even as he considered the term. No, he didn't think antisocial applied. It's more of, I don't know, he scrubbed a hand through his hair in frustration. They aren't trying to kill me. The amusement beside him bled away slowly. They aren't trying to kill you, but neither are they people who had fought with you, bled with you, taken a sword through the chest for you. Their eyes met and held for a long moment, and then Suzuki blew out a long breath. Yeah, I get what you mean. Yukimaru sat up. How do you cope? He demanded. I tried to walk down the street, but it was just so hard to hold myself back, to not react when they passed too near, to not respond as I would to a threat. How do you do it? I think of those early days, before the Winter War started in earnest, when I could still pretend to be a normal high school student, just one who moonlights as a substitute Shinigami. Suzuki gave a wry twitch of his lips. It helps that few people dare to crowd the heir of the clan, and neither Yoruichi Nisama nor Kisuke-san registers as a threat. Yukimaru gave him a completely blank stare. My first memory is of you, he reminded, your fingers still brushing across the Hagioku embedded in Aizen's chest. His features twisted unrecognizable with rage, right before he swatted you through 6 walls. The first time he had manifested outside King's mindscape, discombobulated and disoriented, sprawled ungainly over the rubble. The first time he took a shuddering breath and saw the world through his own eyes, felt the sharp debris cut into his skin, tasted the dust lingering in the air. The first time he could stop and think, crystal clear, without the hurricane of 1,000 voices in his ear, howling at him to rip tear kill. They were still present, in the background, but muted somehow, more akin to a draft than a tempest, something he could ignore with the ease of decades of practice as white. The first time he met Aizen Sasuke face to face, he had staggered to his feet, weak as a newborn kitten, and seen the cruel smirk tugging at the madman's lips. "Kneel and be welcome, my newest Arankar." As a hollow, survival had always been the most important thing. Eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. The world was colored a blessedly simple black and white. When someone stronger than you came along, you bowed to them to survive. No doubt that was why even the self-proclaimed king of Huko Baragan Luisenbairn, had swallowed his pride and knelt for Aizen. The first time he had the ability to make his own choices, Yukimaru had reached instinctively for his Zanpakuto. Aizen had not been pleased. It was also the first time he had died, speared through and through by a strike too fast to see. No, it wasn't a good memory, but it was all he had. Oh, Suzuki's eyes slid shut and he grimaced. "Right, you were born in the middle of the war," Yukimaru snorted. "Sharing your head for 4 years must have messed with mine, because no self-respecting hollow would have done that. They'd have knelt to live another day." Startled brown eyes snapped open and fixed on him. "Do you regret it?" Suzuki asked almost hesitantly. Yukimaru didn't need to share his mind to know what Suzuki was thinking, that the other had somehow subconsciously influenced him into making that uncharacteristic choice. "Don't insult me," snapped Yukimaru with feeling. "The first time my mind was my own, the first time I could think for myself, and I chose to do that." The miasma of guilt persisted, prickling uncomfortably against his skin like a particularly scratchy sweater, and he growled, rolling to his feet. "Let's spar." Suzuki blinked up at him. Yukimaru stretched languidly, feeling the pull in his muscles. "Knowing you'd somehow manage to make it rain in here too. I'm going to beat it out of you before that happens." He dropped to all fours, and without giving Suzuki the chance to even get up, swept out a leg with enough force to break a bone on impact. Except that it never connected. The moment he had crouched down, Suzuki had already started moving, and instead of wasting time scrambling to his feet, he had gone for a backwards roll instead, pushing himself upright with his arms and leaping backwards to put more distance between them. Yukimaru grinned savagely. Yoruichi-san was going to rue the day she taught Suzuki, and thus by extension Yukimaru as well, how to incorporate gymnastics into his already eclectic Hakuda style. He almost felt sorry for the Shihoin clan. Almost. They wouldn't know what hit them, literally. "What was that for?" complained Suzuki, though he didn't relax his stance. He could feel the grin on his face widen of its own accord, see the wariness melt off into hard resolve in Suzuki's eyes in response. Good. He hadn't had a decent fight for weeks, not since they'd found out the hard way that Aizen had resurrected his entire Arankar army again. With the resistance numbering so few by then, sending anyone out would have been a suicidal move without fresh intel, and so they had remained holed up in Urahara Shoten. Yukimaru had never intended to hit Suzuki with that move, knowing that instincts if nothing else would have made the other dodge. "Nice to see you haven't completely lost your edge in your dotage," he replied breezily, and without waiting for a response lunged. Suzuki planted his feet firmly against the ground, raising an arm to block Yukimaru's initial punch. Sparks of black Ryatsu flew where fist met forearm, and Suzuki's other arm snaked out, lightning fast, to grab Yukimaru's outstretched arm. Instead of struggling, Yukimaru allowed himself to be pulled closer, the sudden loss of resistance buying him the split second of surprise he needed to duck into instead of away from Suzuki and flip him over his shoulder in a judo throw. To his credit, though Yukimaru wouldn't have expected any less, Suzuki landed in a perfect roll, slapping the ground with a Ryatsu-enhanced hand to propel himself backwards. He was already on his feet as he landed, skidding backwards in a ready stance. Yukimaru smirked. Looks like he was finally going to take it seriously. As though cued by a silent signal, they burst into Shunpo at the same moment, exchanging a flurry of Ryatsu-enhanced strikes, deflecting what they couldn't evade. Karate strikes mixed with jabs at pressure points meshed together with staple street brawl punches. Moves from a dozen different styles flowing fluidly into each other with the long experience only gained from a decade of fighting. First against humans, then against all manners of spiritual beings. When the Winter War had taken a swing for the worse, Yoruichi had pulled aside the humans, easily the least experienced in the resistance, and demanded to see their unarmed combat styles. Orihime had used a textbook karate style, the way that Tatsuki had taught her. Chad's repertoire favored power over subtlety, featuring a variety of boxing moves. Oryu had pulled out some Quincy style from somewhere, all the while rather peevishly muttering that it was nearly impossible to disarm him and therefore all this was really rather unnecessary. His spar had ended with him on the ground, one cheek pressed to the unforgiving surface. Yoruichi seemed completely oblivious to his baleful glare, casually, pointedly, twirling his Quincy cross around one index finger. Then it was their turn. Yoruichi wasn't known as a Hakuda master for nothing, and thus despite being clearly caught off guard by King's unorthodox moves, she dodged without missing a beat. After a mere few minutes of going on the defensive, she had switched to the offensive. All of her blows, the duo had quickly found out, didn't seem to have much force behind them, but they hurt. It was one of those times when Yukimaru wished that pain didn't transmit into the mindscape whenever he decided to lend King his Ryatsu. They target nerve clusters, she had explained, after calling the spar to a halt. Even though it had barely been half an hour, every inch of them had ached and rattled as though she had shaken their very bones apart. To add insult to injury, the way she just seemed to twist away from all their attacks, even when enhanced with a hollow's speed, made them suspect that she had the advantage of preternatural feline agility. When King had called her out on it, a familiar glint in her eye that they had come to associate, painfully, with nothing good appeared. Oi, Kisuke. On the far side of the underground training grounds, Urahara Kisuke turned in their direction, one hand still holding some instrument that he had been fiddling with. Gray eyes widened comically as Yoruichi was suddenly in his personal space, foot flying towards his face in a move they had seen countless times from Hiyori, except Hiyori had never moved so fast. It was clear that the title Goddess of Flash was well deserved. Had she just crossed the entirety of the training grounds in a single blink? Then King's mouth fell open when Kisuke bent over backwards at the waist until blonde hair swept the ground, his free hands shooting out to keep his bucket hat from falling off. Yukimaru would have laughed at Ichigo's resemblance to a fish if he himself wasn't also busy gaping in astonishment when the shopkeeper neatly swiveled his waist to twist his upper body around the downward blow Yoruichi aimed at his chest, and then pivoted 180 on one foot to bring his own leg up to block her follow-up kick. "This is fragile," he had protested, cradling the gadget protectively to his chest without so much as a wobble, looking for all the world as though he was so used to balancing on one leg that he hardly noticed the difference. Ignoring him with the ease of long practice, Yoruichi grinned at her captive audience, lowering her leg slowly. "As you can see," she had announced, the look on her face rather reminiscent of a cat with a saucer of cream, "it can be learnt." Kisuke blinked in bemusement, looking from her to the teenagers. Did I miss something? Instead of trying to correct his Hakuda into something more conventional, like so many other instructors would have done, Yoruichi had taken one look at Ichigo's formless style, and given him the tools to turn it into the finely honed weapon it was today. His hand-to-hand had never been bad, but usually it was a case of him giving as good as he got, and he had had many a black eye to show for that attitude. Yoruichi showed him how she could not only hold her own, but come out on top in a world populated by giants brandishing even more gigantic swords. How the extra reach that their weapons granted them meant nothing when they couldn't hope to hit her even at close range, a feat that only a combination of her speed and flexibility could achieve. Speaking of which, I doubt either of us did our daily exercises in the past few days. Suzuki clapped a hand to his forehead, straightening. Don't tell her. At an unspoken agreement, they both turned to gaze into the endless horizon. Yukimaru bounced lightly on the ground. It would have to do. It wasn't like either of them risked falling from doing basic exercises, anyway. 500 cartwheels. Here we come, muttered Suzuki cheerlessly, looking grimly resolute. We are never telling her about this, warned Suzuki, flopping down on the ground in exhaustion after having crammed 5 days' worth of exercise into one day. She'll triple the current exercise regimen for her own sadistic pleasure, and probably have the time limit, Yukimaru added, agreeing wholeheartedly. About to open his mouth to no doubt commiserate, Suzuki shut it with a click, brow furrowed in faint concentration. Someone just entered my room. Without warning, his body shimmered and vanished from their mindscape. Yukimaru sat up straight, alarms pounding in his head. The intruder wasn't someone whom Suzuki had recognized, and thus by virtue of that fact was most likely not an ally. On the upside, it wasn't Aizen. On the downside, well, there was a lot of room for error between Aizen and not a threat. He got to his feet and began pacing, unable to sit still anymore. King would be fine. The only Shinigami who could pose a threat to him right now was probably Aizen, and the Siteicho, he supposed, and several of the eldest captains. But what were the chances of them sneaking into Suzuki's bedroom in the middle of the night? A brief vision of Anohana climbing through the window of Suzuki's bedroom like Renji used to do popped into his mind, and he had to stifle a very inappropriate snicker. The ground trembled. Yukimaru's right hand whipped instinctively to his back before he belatedly realized that, no, he didn't have Zenjutsu strapped to his back anymore. Nor could he materialize in front of Suzuki anymore, he supposed. His hand clenched into a fist at the thought. Having spent most of his life in the other man's mindscape, he could recognize the signs immediately. For whatever reason, Suzuki had just released the tight hold he normally had over his Ryatsu. Although the ground was no longer shaking, concentric circles of disturbance continued rippling outwards from where he stood. With an effort, Yukimaru dragged his gaze off the ground. The dissonance between the stillness of the air and the movement in the ground was disorientating. A shift in the air alerted to the sudden appearance of his Zanpakuto spirit behind him. "You wish to go to him?" It wasn't phrased as a question, but he replied anyway for lack of anything better to do. "Of course." "Why?" Yukimaru's head swiveled around, pinning his Zanpakuto spirit with an incredulous look. "Why? What kind of question was that?" "He needs me." The figure's serene expression didn't change. "Does he?" Without giving Yukimaru the chance to retort, the spirit continued, "You just said it yourself. Save for Aizen, no one else is likely to pose any danger to Suzuki at this time of the night. And Shihoin Yoruichi is but a single room away from him. Does he really need your assistance?" Its gaze sharpened. "Or are you simply craving bloodshed, little hollow?" It took Yukimaru several moments to find his voice, and even longer to formulate a coherent response. "How dare you?" he snarled. "I may have been a hollow once, but that has nothing to do with. Do you deny your heritage?" "I have been many things," snapped back Yukimaru. "I have been a hollow, then a Zanpakuto spirit, then a hollow-feed spirit, and finally an Arankar. This doesn't change who I am now." "Ah, yes, an Arankar. Tell me, former Arankar, what was your aspect of death?" Yukimaru's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, momentarily thrown by the question. Defiance. His voice was quiet, but his chin was up, just daring the spirit to challenge him on that. He wasn't necessarily proud of the fact. An Arankar's aspect of death was, after all, their main weakness and what usually got them killed. But it was a part of him, and to hell with anyone who dared to tell him that defying Aizen had been the stupid move. Did they think he didn't already know all that? If he'd knelt for Aizen that day, the war would have been over long ago. The newly born Arankar had access to all of King's memories, starting with the locations of and the passwords to every single resistance stronghold. He had no doubt Aizen would have been able to imprison King within his own mindscape, leaving him in charge of the physical body. It would have been horribly easy to pass off as the human teenager. Moody and sullen wasn't hard to pull off, and to shred the wards protecting Urahara Shoten when Aizen came knocking. The wards had been designed to withstand traitors from the inside. Of course, Urahara Kisuke was nothing if not thorough, but King had helped to erect the wards in the first place with his massive Ryatsu reserves, and was thus keyed into the foundations. He could have been on the winning side of the war. And yet, knowing all of that, you challenged Aizen anyway. Eyes the hue of sunset pierced through him. Drunk on your newfound freedom, engorged with your own self-importance, did you do it for the novelty of making a choice? Yukimaru's growl was very nearly subsonic, and the ground shivered with his rising Ryatsu. I would have thought my own Zanpakuto spirit would have known me better than that. He couldn't quite hide the disappointment dripping from his words, though his tone remained acerbic. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Unbidden, an image of Karin and Yuzu on their first day of middle school floated to mind. It had been before the war had started in earnest, and their big brother had specially taken the time to see them off at the school gates. It was possibly the last time he had seen King smile. There are some things in this world worth fighting for, worth dying for. He sucked in a deep breath. Yes, I like fighting. He was mature enough to admit that, but I'm not a hollow anymore. I don't fight for the sake of causing mindless destruction. If you can't accept a former hollow for a wielder, then fine, I don't need you. Better a soulless sword than a Zanpakuto that didn't trust its owner, or worse, actively undermined its owner. A single Quincy Zangetsu was enough for one lifetime. His Zanpakuto spirit inclined its head regally, and for a moment the perpetual flames cloaking it grew too bright for him to keep his eyes on the enshrouded figure within. We will speak again. When he looked up again, Yukimaru found himself standing alone once more. He blinked rapidly in bewilderment. What had all that been about? It being only mid-February, Rukia was still caught in the throes of winter. Sitting on a convenient fallen log, Yukimaru examined his only change of clothing critically. There was no helping it, he decided. He would have to venture back to town. At least he didn't smell. The nearby stream, after he had successfully cracked the ice, made for a decent bath, a steady source of water, and some fish. He was even getting better at creating campfires with judicious applications of fire kaido on hapless twigs. However, that begged the question, what could he use to trade for a new set of clothes? He owned literally nothing but the clothes on his back, and they weren't in the best condition after so many repeated washes. Perhaps he would have more luck if he scouted out the town beforehand. Surely he could find something that he could do. Yukimaru hopped off the log, pulled his clothes back on, and started the long trek back to civilization. He was a genius, he decided, peering out at the town from the relative safety atop a tree. Firewood. Each of the hamlets had a small bundle of firewood stacked neatly against one of the walls, visible through the window. He crept closer, peeking into each of the windows, trying to see if he could find which one his mother lived in. He didn't have much luck, unfortunately, and it was already getting dark. He could probably spend the night gathering as much fallen branches as possible, and head back during daylight hours. Thus decided, he turned and was about to head back to the tree line, when a quiet scuffle caught his attention. Making a split-second decision, Yukimaru crouched and easily leapt onto the roof of the nearest hamlet, using the roofs as a shortcut to reach the source of the sound faster. "Don't make me hurt you, woman." His ears pricked and he scrambled sideways, slinking closer to the edge of the roof for a better view. "You can't," a familiar voice replied coolly, and his heart did some sort of jittery flutter. His mother had a bag tucked under her arm, a burly man blocking her path. From the symbol sewn onto his clothes, he was probably a member of a gang. He didn't look too happy at the implied insult to his abilities. His mother frowned, ducking the clumsy punches thrown her way, but did not retaliate. Frustrated at his inability to hit her, the gang member charged. Without pausing, she shifted her position and stuck out a leg. He flailed as he tripped, hitting his head on the ground and letting out a yell of pain. That seemed to be the signal the rest of the gang was waiting for, as several more menacing figures sauntered out into the deserted street. The biggest one, obviously the gang leader from his demeanor, sneered and stepped forward while the rest fanned out to surround his mother. He had seen enough. Yukimaru hopped off the roof into a side alley and came barreling out before the gang leader could even open his mouth. "Hey," he yelled. "What kind of cowards are you to gang up on a lady?" For a moment the gang members stood, stunned at the direct challenge. From the corner of his eye, he could see his mother pursing her lips worriedly, but did not warn him to stay away, trusting the newcomer to know what he was doing. Yukimaru appreciated it. A district so high up, a person did not stay alive by interfering in fights they could not win, and she clearly knew that she was outnumbered. Slowly, the gang leader turned to face him. At a slight gesture, the nearest two attacked. Yukimaru jumped over the first punch, using his momentum to kick the first one in the face and immediately ducking to avoid the second one from sneaking up on him. He effortlessly dispatched his other opponent, returning the gang leader's shrewd look with his own emotionless stare. "Get her." White-hot fury seared through him. He was their opponent, not her. Never her. He blurred in front of the nearest gang member, sending the man flying several meters away. The remaining thugs hesitated, but at a rallying cry from their leader, charged en masse at his mother. Unacceptable. Eliminate. Stop. For a moment, he could only stare blankly at the woman blocking his way, his palm quivering scant centimeters away from her throat. He had barely pulled the blow in time, his reflexes screaming at him. Not a threat. Yukimaru blinked dazedly, withdrawing his hand slowly. Only then did he register the bodies littering the street, hear the occasional pained groan. Finish the job, his instincts were telling him. Eliminate the threats before they hurt someone you care about. Why did you stop me? His mother was watching him, wariness warring with worry in her eyes. Up close, he could see that King had indeed inherited his mother's eyes. You were going to kill them. They were going to kill you, countered Yukimaru, confused. If someone punched you, you punch them back, and make sure they can't get back up to punch your friends when you weren't around. Wasn't that how things worked? She shook her head, brown curls bouncing in the moonlight. They were only after the food. My life was never in danger. Before you intervened went unsaid. But they wanted to hurt you. He couldn't understand it. Why did you protect them? Because if somebody died because I did nothing, I don't think I'd be able to forgive myself for that. Her voice was soft, but resolute. Yukimaru scratched at his head, casting a dubious look in her direction. Well, if she insisted. He gave the gangsters one last glance, dismissing them almost immediately. None of them would be getting up any time soon. Now, what had he been about to do? Oh, yes, firewood. He had barely taken 5 steps towards the tree line in the far distance when her voice stopped him again. Where are you going? Half turning, Yukimaru jerked a thumb in the vague direction where he had spent the last fortnight. I need to get back before it gets too dark to find my way. He could probably find a new place to sleep since he hadn't left anything behind. But he liked where he'd stayed. It would be annoying to find another stream. Even in the gloom, he could see her begin to frown. I didn't know people lived in the forests. He turned his attention to the trees in surprise. There were others living in the forest besides him. I didn't know there were others. His reply was phrased in a questioning tone. At least, I haven't seen anyone else in the last 2 weeks. There was a pregnant pause. And then, are you telling me that you spent 2 weeks of winter alone in the forest? Wearing that? Yes, he replied slowly. I'm only in town today because I needed a new set of clothes. He gestured to the worn and faded garments he was wearing. And I came to see what other people needed, something that I could use to trade with. His mother looked as if she was trying to stop herself from saying something, although Yukimaru couldn't fully understand the expression on her face. He'd have to ask Suzuki to parse it later. Is something wrong? I have a spare room, she declared apropos of nothing. And I can make you a new set of clothes. In return, I need you to do some manual labor around the house. Yukimaru opened his mouth and then closed it again. This could all be an elaborate trap, but then, given what he knew of his mother, this generosity seemed to be par for the course for her. I could gather firewood, he offered cautiously, and I'm pretty good with heavy lifting. Her eyes cut to the gangsters, some of whom had regained consciousness, and who were trying to slink away unobtrusively. I've noticed. Turning her back on them, she started down a different path leading to a cluster of hamlets near the rice fields. I live this way. Humans, Yukimaru decided as he trotted obediently behind her, were weird. Kurosaki Kyoko, or Kyoko-san as she had insisted he call her, was a weaver. She owned a modest plot of land in the fields, where she grew the fibers that she needed. It being winter, the fields didn't need tilling, though she had made it clear that come spring this would no longer be the case. Yukimaru didn't mind. In addition to chopping firewood, he helped out with the general repairs of the hamlet. It helped that he didn't have trouble keeping his footing on the snow-covered roofs, what were slippery roofs compared to fighting for your life, knee-deep in rubble. Although he did have to use a ladder to keep up appearances after the first time he scaled up the wall, and nearly gave Kyoko a heart attack. Seeing this, she began sending him to the other villagers when their homes needed repairs, and before he knew it, he had somehow turned into the village handyman. Suzuki had been very amused. I wish there was more to eat, though, Yukimaru griped, laying out his futon beside the open window. Did you know that souls in Rukangai only need to eat once every few days? There was a thoughtful pause on the other end, or it could be that Suzuki had accidentally slipped out of Jinzen again. They were still ironing out the kinks of trying to communicate without actually entering their mindscape. Now I do, his brother finally replied. How are you coping? Kyoko-san looked weird when she realized that I was still regularly going into the forest. It had been an interesting conversation, to say the least. He had lost track of time one day, and night had crept up on him before he realized how late it was. He flitted into as fast a shunpo as he dared with such limited visibility. Suzuki would no doubt laugh himself sick if he ran into a tree, and made it to town in record time. Where were you? Kyoko-san had asked the moment he set foot through the door. Yukimaru glanced up sharply, momentarily stunned by her vehemence. He hesitated a moment, but the compulsion to be honest with his mother was too strong. Damn Ichigo's morals. And he finally told her an abbreviated version of the truth. I was looking for alternative sources of food in the forest. Mother or not, he wasn't about to tell her that he needed at least one meal a day to survive. Everyone in Rukangai knew what it meant when someone was hungry. It's not that I don't trust her, he found himself explaining, needing someone to understand. If I told her, I know she'll insist on feeding me. In a town this small, the additional groceries she would need to buy wouldn't go unnoticed for long. And neither of you need the kind of attention this would bring, finished Suzuki quietly. The Kano will only respond in two ways, either they'll demand you join their guard retinue, or they'll kill you. His mother had eyed him contemplatively. Come back before dark, was all she said in the end. It's not safe out there at night. Yukimaru silently resolved to remember to bring his axe every time he entered the forest in the future, to make it look as if he was gathering firewood instead. He could almost hear Suzuki nod thoughtfully. She's worried about you, his brother explained. Worried? Yukimaru couldn't understand why. Wasn't it already clear that he could handle himself? It's an irrational emotion humans feel when someone whom they care about does something that they consider dangerous. Yukimaru snorted. You totally repeated that verbatim from Urahara-san. Instead of protesting as he'd expected, Suzuki sent back the mental equivalent of a shrug. He's far more eloquent than I am. I would have said something like, it's what people do when they like you. His version is a lot more helpful, and explains why none of us is worried about you spending weeks in the forest. What's the worst thing you can stumble into? A nest of hollows. I wonder if hollows taste good barbecued, mused Yukimaru. In response to Suzuki's slightly horrified silence, he retorted. What? I'm really sick of fish. I'll think of something, promised his brother. Let's leave that as a last resort, shall we? Winter melted slowly into spring, and gradually the days began to grow longer. When all the snow was finally gone, Kyoko began showing him how to work the fields. Yukimaru didn't mind the manual labor, because at least it was something to do. Not that he begrudged Suzuki his job, rather. Had it been him, he would probably have tried to murder half the clan within the week. King had far more patience and empathy than he did, seriously. He didn't even maim those idiotic brats that had burst into his room the other day, interrupting their conversation. People who waited until their target was asleep, or so they thought. To act couldn't have been up to any good. If it were up to him, he'd have given them a lot worse than a mere slap on the wrist, like maybe a little bit of maiming. If Suifeng could fight with one arm, he was sure they could learn to do the same. Well, King had been so startled by the intrusion that he had accidentally flared his Ryatsu, and that had woken up Yoruichi. Those brats had probably gotten what they deserved, he supposed. That cat was vicious if her nap time was interrupted. Though, it was equally probable that she ended up punishing Suzuki, since it was his fault that she had awoken at all. He snickered to himself, ignoring all the odd looks shot his way. Man, he was so glad he wasn't entangled in that mess. A roar shook the forest. Yukimaru nearly dropped the bundle in his arms, turning to gape at the tree line. Nearby, other farmers straightened up slowly from their own crops, and he could see a few pick up whatever blunt instrument they had at hand. The fields were located on the outskirts of town, and judging by the increasing sounds of crashing they could all hear, there wasn't enough time to escape. Not that some of them didn't try, tearing down the dirt road back to town. Yukimaru shook his head. Stupid, it wasn't like there was some kind of magical barrier protecting the town. Whatever it was that the hunting party had enraged wouldn't be stopped by flimsy wooden constructs. All they would be doing was effectively inciting a panic. He'd seen the hunting party go in earlier that day, a pack of dogs snapping at their heels, and had been looking forwards to what they could bring back. Vegetables were good and all, but he was seriously craving some meat here, one of the disadvantages of growing up with an abundance of food in the late 20th century. Meat had always been in plentiful supply back in the future. Looks like we won't be getting deer tonight, he sighed woefully. A nearby farmer snorted, hefting his pitchfork. We should probably worry about not becoming bear food first. A bear. The farmer squinted at him. Yeah, big brown furry animal with claws. I know what a bear is, Yukimaru snapped back. To his surprise, the farmer gave him a nod of apology. My apologies. For what? He had to ask. Usually when he snapped at people, they yelled back at him, not apologized to him. And especially not one so senior to him, as this man clearly was. Well, someone as young as you usually only knows what a bear looks like because you died from being attacked by one. Yukimaru paused. How did he know what a bear looked like? The answer came easily. Of course, Ichigo had once seen one in a zoo. That explained a lot. Did they even have zoos in this time period? Even saying that he had seen a picture from a book would be suspect. Apparently, most of the inhabitants, most of Rukangai in fact, were illiterate. Yukimaru was really thankful that Suzuki had imparted that piece of vital information before he accidentally outed himself with the fact that he could both read and write. Picture books were rare and expensive, only found in noble households. To say that he had read one would have been tantamount to admitting he was a noble-born child. And wouldn't the Kano have a field day with that tidbit? Man, he really missed the future. Another roar thundered through the forest, and this time he could pick up the howling of dogs and the snapping of tree branches, even without channeling Ryatsu to his ears to enhance his hearing. They must be close then. Yukimaru hefted his own hoe, testing the weight of it in his hand. It was such a pity he no longer had a Zanpakuto strapped to his back. Not that he needed one, necessarily, but displaying advanced Hakuta skills was just begging for a trip to the Kano's prisoner cells. He really didn't want to live as a criminal on the run for the next century. Or worse, have to call upon the Shihoin to bail him out and ruin all their careful planning. So that meant no advanced Hakuta, no Hoho, no Kaido, and no obvious Senjutsu. At least he didn't have to worry about this last one. Ichigo had never been taught Zanjutsu to start with. There just hadn't been enough time during the war to instruct him in the proper stances that would normally take years to perfect. Yukimaru twirled the hoe in one hand, feeling the familiar maniacal grin tug at his lips. He did so love a challenge. A flash of brown, barely visible through the thicket of trees, was all the warning he got before a blur burst out from the tree line, a wasteland of snapped branches trailing in its wake. Almost immediately, his hands shifted their grip on the handle before he consciously unclenched one hand. This wasn't a katana. He didn't need two hands to wield it. His left foot slid back a fraction, bracing the majority of his weight against the ground. Me, king. Any idea where the weaknesses are on a bear? Probably the eyes, if he could reach those. Few things, be they animals, humans, Shinigami or hollows, could handle the loss of an eye. He wondered if he could manage to take a paw off. No, too risky. He had to make it look like he'd gotten lucky. Someone broke under the stress, screaming and charging at the bear. Small beady eyes zeroed in on the approaching threat, the bear changing directions to meet it head-on. Even he had to wince at the resultant wet squelch of shredded flesh and the screech of claws along bone. Civilians were so fragile. Do I want to know? Suzuki's reply was part exasperated, part apprehensive. I'm going to kill one. Yukimaru cocked his head, narrowing his eyes at the rampaging bear. It was pissed. He supposed that he couldn't really blame it. If some idiot intruded on his territory, he'd probably have reacted the same way. Scratch that, this bear was intruding on his territory. Suzuki had yet to reply, so it was going to have to be the eyes then. He doubted that this hoe, with its flimsy quality, could reach the less exposed parts anyway. Congratulations, you just managed to render Kisuke-san speechless for a record 10 seconds. The snicker that Yukimaru involuntarily let escape was probably terrifying the other civilians. But what did he care about that? And what did he say? There was a slight pause, and then Suzuki responded with what must be a verbatim quote. Setting aside the question of why you are facing a bear as of this moment, the eyes and the mouth when open are vulnerable parts. Yukimaru shook his head, grip tightening on his makeshift weapon, eyes tracking the movements of the bear. Eyes and mouth. He could reach that. Itadakimasu. Itarashai. Suzuki replied automatically, before squawking at him. What? Where are you going? Yukimaru ignored him in favor of bending his knees slightly. The bear was currently on a trajectory that would take it within lunging distance to him. He breathed in and out, slowly, focus narrowing down to the threat. Incoming. He dropped automatically and rolled out of the way, just as a pair of panicked oxen trampled through where he had been standing a moment ago. Yukimaru came up, cursing, foot slipping on the freshly tilled soil. Too late, he realized that his instinctive maneuver had brought him almost directly into the path of the bear, and he gritted his teeth, bracing himself for the impact. Squinty angry eyes locked on his figure, the bear giving a low enraged growl as it spotted him. Come and get me, Yukimaru whispered, twirling the hoe absently in both hands until they found a grip that they liked. His brain stuttered out an alert, forcing him to sidestep again just as a body crashed heavily into the ground next to him. The farmer from earlier, he vaguely recognized. Not a threat. Analyzed the small part of his brain not devoted to tracking the weak points on the bear. Protect. Yukimaru crouched slightly, and then sprang. His aim was true, and the hoe smashed into the bear's face, carving a bloody slash from brow to cheek. The bear howled in agony and fury, giant paws coming up to claw at the air, half blinded by the blood streaming freely from one ruined eye. Yukimaru cursed again, abandoning the hoe and leaping backwards before they could make contact. With a final scream, the bear tore the hoe from its face, flinging it away. Keeping the enraged bear in his peripheral vision, he glanced wildly around for a substitute makeshift weapon. Barehanded combat was far too dangerous in this situation. Slipping up and accidentally revealing his skills was not an option here. There, it took 2 long strides to reach the abandoned trowel, snatch it up, and swivel back around to face the bear. Yukimaru hefted it in one hand, considering. Not very sharp. He'd either have to use more force or aim for blunt trauma. He spun it in one hand, absently tossing it up and catching it on the way down, watching the way the bear dropped to all fours, its maw gaping open. Wait a minute. Yukimaru frowned considering. Yes, this could work. The trowel thudded back into his palm, and he curled his fingers over the handle, waiting. One foot pulled back, taking the majority of his weight, while his free arm came up, hand pointed straight at the bear. The next time the bear opened its mouth to roar, Yukimaru stepped forwards, transferred all his weight to the foot in front and flung the trowel into its mouth like a javelin. At point-blank range with the jaws open wide, it was nearly impossible to miss, even with the trowel not being perfectly balanced for throwing. It slammed into the back of the bear's throat, causing the beast to rear back onto its hind legs for a moment, growl gurgling in its throat. With any luck, it would have caused some internal damage. He might have added a touch of Ryatsu to that throw. Possibly, he actually had no idea whether or not his instincts had overridden his conscious mind in this case. Circling cautiously around the screaming and flailing animal, he made a beeline for his abandoned hoe, spinning around with it in hand to meet the bear face on. Yukimaru growled, nearly subsonic, and although it was much softer than the bear's own outraged yowls, it was clear that his opponent had heard him by the way it reared back again, choking out a snarl in response to his challenge. You won't hurt anyone ever again. He sprinted forwards, ducking around a paw, using his momentum to bury the hoe into the bear's skull. The metal bit deep, the shock running up his arms, and he had to fight the urge to channel Ryatsu through the shaft. There was a dull crack, barely audible over the dying snarls of the beast, and he could feel something, likely the skull, give way. Yukimaru gritted his teeth, forcing the metal blade of the hoe even deeper into the bear's brain. "Come on," he screamed mentally. "Just die already." The bear didn't seem inclined to obey, and he finally had to dive out of the way when the wild flailing became too much to bear. He shook out his numb arms, eyes fixed on the animal thrashing a safe distance away. It was dying, he was sure of it, just very slowly. His hands twitched with the effort of keeping them still, of not putting it out of its misery. But any more and he would run the very real risk of blowing his entire cover. In fact, he wasn't sure if what he had done hadn't already blown his cover. He'd worry about that later. The bear seemed to take an age to die, though realistically speaking it was probably only a few minutes. Yukimaru stood guard solemnly, watching the light fade out of the bear's remaining eye, as its thrashing and struggling slowed, and finally stopped. The ground was splattered with bloodstains as though it was a scene right out of the Minos forest. It wasn't his first kill, not by a long shot, but it was the first time in a long while that he had killed something that wasn't deliberately trying to kill him back. Not since he had become embedded in Masaki and later on Ichigo, in fact. And as an Arankar, his kills were quick, clean. They were never this messy. "I am no longer a hollow." His hand balled into a fist, knuckles whitening. Then the cheers started. Yukimaru startled, for the first time noticing the gathered crowd. He scratched the back of his head slowly. Oops. Sliding the door open, he was greeted by a blast of hot air. Thank the gods for an engineering genius, Suzuki thought to himself as he squinted to see past the thick steam that hung in the air, shutting the door behind him to keep the heat in. Which other clan could boast a private onsen for the clan head's sole usage? The original hot spring was located in the main Shihoin onsen, but a stream had been diverted off to the clan head's wing to create a separate private bath, sunken into the ground in a stone pool. Making his way to the bath, Suzuki sank into the hot water, letting out a soft sigh. Yeah, he could totally understand Yoruichi and Kisuke's obsession with hot springs now. Even if it wasn't enhanced like the rest of the blonde's creations, the hot water alone was soothing on his aching muscles after a whole day of training. The Shihoin were probably listed somewhere in the dictionary under the word sadistic. "Enjoying yourself? Gah!" he shrieked, flailing ungainly and smashing his elbow painfully against the edge of the bath. "Itai." He rubbed at the spot, glaring at Yoruichi. How did he even miss her presence in the first place? He would never understand. Her Ryatsu flexed and uncoiled over the ripples he had created, like a lazy cat making itself comfortable in a sunny spot. The closest he had ever seen her to being relaxed. He bit down hard on the instinctive "what are you doing here" that almost slipped out. There was no need to lower her opinion of his intelligence any further. She smirked at him anyway, a Cheshire grin that suggested she knew exactly what he had been about to say. "That's not very nice, Yoruichi-san." Kisuke-san. It wasn't a shriek, no matter what anyone said. Head snapping to the right so fast that he almost gave himself whiplash, Suzuki peered through the steam just in time to see the former shopkeeper break the surface opposite to Yoruichi, wet blonde hair plastered to his face. Suzuki opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "Am I, interrupting something?" "Yes," Kisuke replied at the same time Yoruichi asked, "What did you think we were doing in here?" A beat. Just enough time for Suzuki to process those words and his face heat up from far more than the steam in the air. And then, "You're welcome to join us, of course." He might just be the first Shinigami to figure out how to spontaneously combust. I'm flattered, but he managed to choke out, before Yoruichi's full-bellied laugh drowned off the rest of whatever he was about to say. "Look at him, he looks like a ripe tomato. Try not to traumatize him permanently, will you? We still need him. You're no fun, Kisuke." "She's right, though. We won't mind you joining us," Suzuki spluttered, deciding that retreat was the better part of valor. "Okay, I'm going now, have a good time you two." He stood up, and was preparing to hightail out of the door, dignity be damned, when he was interrupted. "You're just too easy to tease, Suki-chan," chortled Yoruichi. "Sit down." He sat, cautiously wary of what she wanted. They were just messing with him, right? They didn't actually want him to join in an. He couldn't even say the word in his own head without turning red. "You want to finish what you were doing earlier before we were interrupted, Kisuke." His resolve was crumbling with every moment. If the blonde dove underwater again or moved any closer to her, he finally decided he was going to bolt. A lifetime of teasing was a small price to pay for not being mentally scarred for life. Kisuke did none of those things. What he did do was sprawl out over his side of the bath, head tipped back until it rested against the ground, his ryatsu curling through the mist. And really, how did Suzuki miss both their presences when he first came in? And drape his folded towel over his forehead. So, as I was saying, I tailed the messenger back to their base of operations in North District 53, an abandoned manor deep in the woods. There were guard rotations 3 times a day, squads of 4 each, dressed in standard black market-issue short swords and chain armor. In other words, Yoruichi concluded dryly, highly suspicious for a simple Shinigami outpost with nothing to hide. She stretched languidly, absently running her fingers through her short hair and frowning when they met air. Tell me something I don't already know, Kisuke. The blonde didn't bother raising his head to look at her. And what makes you think I have information that the regular Onmitsukido scouts can't give you, Yoruichi-san? Yoruichi rolled her eyes. If I wanted something the regular Onmitsukido could get, I wouldn't have bothered sending you. It took longer than Suzuki would admit for him to realize what was going on. Wait, he sat up with a splash. You're giving a mission report. In the bath, the former shopkeeper cracked an eye open and fixed him with a very unimpressed look. But why in the onsen of all places? He paused. And wait, aren't you the detention unit commander? Why were you sent on a mission? He should know. He had just finished sitting through a lecture about the 5 Onmitsukido branches that week. It all seemed so simple on paper. The executive militia, led by 4th Seat Shihoin Katsuo, was in charge of missions that required active combat. The Patrol Corps, led by Lieutenant Amida Marinashin, was in charge of internal security. The Detention Unit, led by 3rd Seat Urahara Kisuke, was in charge of all the prisons in Serete, including the infamous Maggot's Nest. The Inner Court Troops, led by Captain Shihoin Yoruichi herself, comprised the intra-Serete messengers responsible for classified information. And the Covert Corps, led by Yoruichi's younger brother 5th Seat Shihoin Yushiro, was the intelligence division of the Onmitsukido. Well, Yoruichi drawled, dragging out the word. It takes a special kind of pervert to install surveillance devices in a woman's private bath. Plus water naturally absorbs sound. Kisuke flapped his hand at the thick clouds of steam hanging in the air. This room is effectively soundproof. His arm flopped limply down, creating a small splash when it hit the water. Suzuki narrowed his eyes and took another good look at the room, at the way their ryatsu was roiling thick and low in the mist. And it was like a light bulb went off in his head. You're not releasing your ryatsu because you're relaxed, he stated with surety. You're sweeping the room for bugs and cloaking it further to avoid external detection. Yoruichi's tiny smirk of approval warmed something in his heart. Good job. Why not just use a silencing ward? He glanced between Yoruichi and Kisuke. The former tilted her head at the blonde, and even though he hadn't even opened his eyes, the latter took over as smoothly as if he had actually seen the cue. Kaido is easy to spot if you know the signs, and announce to the whole world that you've something to hide. And before you ask, yes, I could make an undetectable silencing Kaido layered in illusions. But why waste my energy, repeatedly, since we'd have to take it down every time we're done? When a few well-pointed rumors can achieve even better results. He was going to regret asking, he knew it. Rumors. Yoruichi quirked an eyebrow at him. You are aware that the entire clan, probably half the Godai too, knowing the gossip mill, thinks that Kisuke is sleeping with me, right? You mean he's not? Suzuki retorted without thinking, and then clapped a hand over his mouth the moment the words left his mouth. Yoruichi blinked at him. Suzuki blinked back. Kisuke snored, very loudly and very pretentiously. Yoruichi's face twitched, and for a moment Suzuki thought she was going to start laughing again. For a given meaning of sleep, I suppose. So, you started that rumor. It's not hard. Kisuke shrugged, rolling over to face Suzuki. Make sure to get caught by a servant while leaving her bedroom in the morning a few times. Be seen entering the onsen while she's known to be inside, and before long the whole clan thinks they know what's going on. It gives me a much greater degree of freedom than I would have had otherwise. Do you want my report or not? That last sentence was clearly not directed towards him. Yoruichi pinched the bridge of her nose. I'm not going to like it, am I? She asked in a tone of resignation. Kisuke was quiet for a moment. You're right, it's something you need a corps commander to handle, he finally said. They're being paid to smuggle people across the districts. Suzuki had the rare pleasure of hearing Yoruichi swear. How did we miss it the last time? she asked rhetorically, holding up a hand to forestall any answers. Never mind. Up or down the districts. And by people, I'm going to assume you meant Yakuza. What's their motive? Both ways. And it's not just the Yakuza, there's at least one minor noble clan that is known to utilize their services. Motivation depends on the group. The Yakuza appear to be in search of more fertile hunting grounds, whereas the clan that we know of was conducting a transfer for someone originally assigned to a different district. The blonde sighed, very softly. And to think, we wouldn't even know about this smuggling ring if it wasn't for an anonymous tip from a trusted source. Wait, Suzuki burst in, finally realizing why that description sounded so familiar. You mean Yukimaru? Kisuke didn't bother looking at him. Like I said, a trusted source. But we didn't know. He struggled for a moment to put everything in words, eventually settling on the most important question. Why is movement between districts restricted, anyway? Originally, they were to ensure an even distribution of residents amongst the 320 districts in Rukia to prevent overcrowding, began Yoruichi, and then she sighed, rubbing her eyes. Nowadays, you've seen the disparity between districts. It wasn't a question, but Suzuki nodded anyway. Can you imagine what would happen if the restrictions weren't there? Everyone would be migrating to the first few districts. He hazarded a guess. Worse, corrected Kisuke tiredly. They would kill for a place in the top 10 districts, if not for themselves, then for their loved ones. There would be riots in the streets. The frightening thing was, he could see that happening. People trampling over each other, the streets painted red with rivers of blood. But that raised a very important question. Then, how did prospective students get through? He remembered Renji once saying that he and Rukia were from the 70s, and wasn't Zaraki from District 80. Yoruichi shook her head slowly, sending water droplets flying everywhere. The walls aren't perfect, they actually only fully extend up to District 20 or so. Past that, the walls only border the populated areas, and the doors were constructed to respond to spikes in Ryatsu, based on the faulty premise that only a trained Shinigami has enough Ryatsu to open them. It's a leftover relic from the old days, an emergency measure for the times when a Shinigami patrol being chased by hollows didn't have the time to scan their pass, or if the person carrying the pass died. Of course, nowadays most patrols use Jigokucho instead of handheld passes, but there have been records of hollows eating the hell butterflies. She pondered for a while. This definitely bears further investigation. Kisuke, give me your best estimate as to the extent of their influence. The former shopkeeper hummed noncommittally. They've got messengers coming from half the major Yakuza gangs from districts 40 and up, and probably more whose sigils I couldn't recognize on sight. And this is just based on my observations in a single week. And many of these gangs are, of course, funded by the lesser houses, Yoruichi added with a sigh. Of all the times for Katsuo-san to be out on an extended mission, he won't be back for another 2, maybe 3 months. Amida Fukitecho, well, she shrugged helplessly. He's not exactly the most discreet of individuals, finished Kisuke diplomatically. But may I ask, why are you already planning a strike team, Yoruichi-san? I would have thought you'd want to watch them for a while to determine all their sponsors first. Because I just got word from Yushiro that the surveillance team in that section has missed 3 consecutive check-ins, so he's leading a team there himself. And you didn't stop him. The blonde jerked upright with a splash, the hand towel dropping into the water, but both of them ignored the discourtesy such an act normally implied. By the time I received the message this morning, he'd already left. Yoruichi exclaimed, the closest to frustrated Suzuki had ever seen her, but Kisuke was already on another track. 3 check-ins, which means they must have been caught before I left. He trailed off. I didn't see any overt prisoners being brought in, but I can't see inside the palanquins, of which there were many in the last 2 days. And I did get the feeling that there was far too much traffic for it to be a typical week. Kisuke, Yoruichi began slowly. What exactly are you implying? I cannot conjecture. He pushed several wet strands of blonde hair away from his face. All I saw were palanquins moving in and out of the mansion in a steady stream, borne by servants sometimes dressed in plain unmarked clothing, sometimes in livery adorned by sigils. To tell for certain, you'll need someone to infiltrate the compound. We don't have that kind of time, Yoruichi stated decisively. If Yushiro were alone I'd be less worried, but his team is not of the same caliber. Kisuke, I'm sorry to do this to you when you just got back, but I'd feel better if he had backup. I understand. He began to rise, slinging the towel over his shoulder as he did so. One last thing, and this isn't an order, would you consider bringing Suzuki with you? Suzuki couldn't help but let slip a noise of confusion at that. Kisuke stilled for a brief moment, and then sat back down on the edge of the bath, steepling his fingers on his lap and regarding her with a blank expression on his face. Explain. We both know he can keep up with you, and he's been cooped up for far too long in the compound. It's not his competency that's in question, interrupted Kisuke, voice hard. His absence is not as easily covered up as mine could be. He didn't break eye contact with her as he continued. To bring this up, you must already have a plan. Yes, her reply was succinct. We tell them the truth, we say that he's with you. And how, precisely, are you going to explain why the third seat of the Onmitsukido, who's nominally only in charge of the detention unit, and your unofficial consort, is spending so much time alone with the Shihoin clan heir? Anyone not in the know thinks that my extended absences are for vacations, and anyone with the clearance level knows that I only handle Class S missions. Hardly the sort of thing you want to endanger the clan heir with. Either way, they'll want to know what I'm doing with him. Yoruichi gave him a look Suzuki couldn't read, but evidently the blonde could. No, definitely not. Kisuke, Yoruichi-san. She broke eye contact first, looking down at the water. Yesterday, I received a missive from Shihoin Seishin, politely worded, very pretty, asking to mentor Suzuki. It would have been possible to hear a pin drop. Suzuki sneaked a peek at Kisuke's face, devoid of even a glimmer of its usual teasing expression, and just as quickly transferred his gaze back down to the water, which Yoruichi also seemed to be intently studying. He had no idea what they were talking about, but he could gather that being mentored by Seishin, whatever that entailed, was something to be avoided at all costs. There's no one else. Yoruichi slowly shook her head. I need to make a counter-offer who can rival Seishin's claim. You're a Shihoin Foster and a decorated corps commander, which has at least a chance of matching his status as the former clan head. Of the other corps commanders, Katsuo-san can't act against his father, the Amida are only retainers, and Yushiro has yet to come of age himself. The blonde sighed, very, very softly. And I suppose reminding him that you had abolished Wakashudo the moment you rose to power 8 decades ago wouldn't be of any use. Suzuki's head snapped up so fast he nearly gave himself whiplash, but Kisuke had already held out a hand, palm towards him, in the universal sign for stop before he could open his mouth. Do you think he'll make a claim for Yushiro-san next? I should like to see him try. Yoruichi growled in the back of her throat. He can argue about how the clan heir serves the interests of the clan and thus he should have a say in Suzuki's training. But he can't override my authority as the head of my own family. Kisuke cracked his neck, nodding thoughtfully. The thing is, even if I were amenable, a Shihoin Foster, even a main branch Foster child, doesn't quite match a former clan head in terms of social status. You'll need a recognized member of the main branch to have a snowball's chance of matching Seishin-san of all people. And there's only 2 ways of becoming a member of your family. By adoption, or by marriage. By clan law you can't adopt me unless I reveal my bankai, which leaves. Yeah. Yoruichi smirked, tiredly. Will you marry me, Kisuke? The blonde was silent for a long moment, and then dropped his head into his hands. What did I do in a previous life to deserve this? He muttered, almost inaudibly. Quite a lot, actually, retorted Yoruichi tartly. Is it so bad? It's not like I would expect anything from you. One blonde eyebrow rose, the rest of his face still hidden from view. I only got a brief glance at your parents' marital contract, so I don't remember much of it. But I do distinctly remember the clause to lay with my lawful husband each night, until I beget a male heir. Isn't that why they had 4 children? He paused for a moment. Not to mention, you'd be throwing me headfirst into a quagmire of political struggles and social maneuvering that I have neither the inclination nor the aptitude for. Yoruichi made the sound a long drawn-out noise. I'd forgotten about that. Never mind, forget I asked. Please formally retract your offer, Yoruichi-san. She frowned faintly, but obliged. I, Shihoin Yoruichi, do formally retract my offer of marriage to one Urahara Kisuke, and doth hereby swear no retribution shall be visited for any perceived slight upon his part for the rejection of my suit. Thank you. He fell silent, then, and Suzuki had no idea what was going through his mind at that moment, save for the fact that Kisuke was definitely thinking of a way out of the current mess they found themselves in. Never mind the fact that Suzuki barely had an idea why it was a problem in the first place. Wakashudo, he knew, was the customary form of apprenticeship amongst the military class in pre-Meiji Japan. He had no idea that Seoul society practiced it. Certainly, Renji and Rukia had made no mention of it. But they weren't born into one of the military clans either. Given that Serete by and large seemed to be caught somewhere between the Muromachi era and the early Edo era, the height of the samurai age, he supposed that he shouldn't have been surprised. History had never been his forte, not that this subject was normally covered during class anyway. The more he tried to remember what he knew about Wakashudo, the more he had a sinking feeling that the history books had romanticized the entire notion. As far as he knew, the mentor was expected to tutor the youth in everything he might need to know, such as martial skills, etiquette, the art of love, the code of honor, and so on, in return for the youth's continued loyalty and devotion. It all sounded a little too good to be always true. He considered what little he knew of Seishin after these few months, no offense to Yoruichi and Kisuke, but they seemed rather biased against the man, and he didn't know why. He was a ruthless man. All the rumors had agreed on this point, as hard on his own family as he was on others. He was famous for his take no prisoners policy during his reign, leading to the nickname Chizome no O, the blood-stained king. On the one hand, Suzuki could understand, and if he could, he was sure that Yoruichi and Kisuke could. Seishin's childhood had coincided with the Sengoku era in the transient world. He'd seen the aftermath of the Winter War, a pandemic spreading across Japan with Karakura town as its epicenter. He couldn't imagine the size of the hollow population after a century of constant warfare. On the other hand, those same rumors also suggested that Seishin did not step down willingly, and that he sought at every opportunity to re-establish his seat of power, something that Yoruichi was doing her best to prevent. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that her generation had been so tired of the constant fighting that they collectively jumped at the chance for new leadership, it was entirely likely a woman, even if she was from the main branch and the then executive militia corps commander, would never have come into power. Even then, sacrifices had to be made. Yoruichi had had to relinquish her former post to Katsuo and agree to be confined to Serete. Purportedly, it was for her own safety, and Suzuki had to stifle an incredulous snort when he first heard that. Yeah, he was starting to see why being apprenticed to Seishin would be something to avoid. Yoruichi-san, Kisuke's voice broke him out of his thoughts. I'm going to need a copy of your oath of office, my oath of office, your clan head contract, your parents' marital contract. Actually, make that as many marital contracts as you can get your hands on without tipping anyone off, especially Seishin-san's if you can manage it, as well as the brotherhood contracts for every corps commander, past or present. Yoruichi was watching him with an indecipherable look. Consider it done. Kisuke gave her a single nod, rising again. Oh, and Suzuki-san, be packed and ready to leave at the west exit in an hour. The door closed on his back with the finality of a thud. Suzuki bit his lip, considered all the questions he had, and then turned to Yoruichi. Where's the west exit? She blinked at him, seemingly awoken from her own reverie. Right, go put on your Onmitsukido uniform. I'll meet you outside your room in 10 minutes to show you where everything is. This is the mission's storeroom. It's manned round the clock by a dedicated rota of servants, explained Yoruichi as they descended the stairs into a roughly hewn stone cavern. Suzuki was already hopelessly lost after the never-ending dizzying arrays of delicately painted Fusuma panels that all looked similar to his uneducated eye. Not to mention that Yoruichi was probably purposefully choosing a route where they'd be least likely to run into anyone else. The Shihoin was a clan that never seemed to sleep, despite the late hour. Good evening, Yoruichi-sama. A head popped up from behind a boulder, the servant girl hurrying out and sinking to her knees until a gesture from Yoruichi bade her rise again. Suzuki-sama. Good evening, Matsuoka-chan. Has Kisuke come by today? Urahara Dancho, asked the girl, Matsuoka, with some surprise. No, he hasn't been to the storeroom since last week. Then we require 2 short-term provision packs, and Suzuki here needs to be properly outfitted. Matsuoka eyed him speculatively. Is my lord right or left-handed? Predominantly right-handed, but I'm ambidextrous, Suzuki stuttered, and almost took a physical step back when her eyes sparkled with unholy glee. Does my lord prefer ranged or melee combat? What sort of weapons are my lord accustomed to? What is my lord's preferred style, blunt trauma or precision strikes? Yoruichi hastily disguised her snort of laughter as a cough, and thankfully rescued him before she could overwhelm him with the slew of questions. Matsuoka-chan, I think a tour of the armory may be more appropriate. Suzuki would be able to pick something suitable for himself. Yes, of course. Matsuoka dropped into a deep bow. My apologies, my lord, I meant no offense. No offense is taken. Suzuki managed to recall in time, and it must have been the correct phrase, for Matsuoka straightened up. All smiles again. He couldn't think of a better way to phrase his next question, so he eventually just asked straight out, what is your name? Matsuoka's eyes widened. This one is called Matsuoka Katon, my lord. Right? Suzuki nodded, valiantly attempting to store her face in his memory. This clan had far too many people. Nice to meet you, Katon-chan. She dropped into a deep bow again. It is an honor, my lord. What's taking you two so long? Yoruichi came back into view, now carrying 2 pouches in her hands. Equipment pouch for field rations and equipment. She responded to his inquisitive look. We didn't expect you to start missions so soon. I'll have to adjust your class schedule to remedy that. They moved past several boulders, until the entrance was no longer visible. Suzuki was starting to suspect underground caverns were a Shihoin thing rather than an Urahara thing, though this one was nowhere as large or as well lit as Kisuke's training grounds. And then, rounding another corner, he saw what they had meant by the armory. There were rows upon rows of all sorts of swords, long, short, curved, straight, hanging next to shelves filled with smaller items he couldn't pick out at that distance. On the far end hung several targets, presumably for practice with. Normally, I wouldn't recommend bringing a sword to a stealth mission. Yoruichi stopped in front of the sword rack. However, the search and rescue component almost certainly carries the risk of combat. There are 6 whom we know to be missing, with another 6 on the way. It will be the 3 of you against an unknown number of fully armed antagonists in the enemy's stronghold. She stepped aside. So, pick something you can work with. Suzuki frowned, running his hands over the display until he found something as close to Tensa Zenjutsu as he could manage. He picked it up from the rack, but before he even unsheathed the katana he knew it wasn't going to work. It was far too light, and the subtle differences in the balance were jarring. Still, he gave it a few experimental swings, and couldn't help the mow of distaste at the lack of connection he had always associated with his previous Zanpakuto. No good? Asked Yoruichi astutely, and pursed her lips. I think Kisuke had been meaning to make you a replica of your old sword, but he's been busy lately. She picked up a shorter sword, a wakizashi, and tossed it at Suzuki. Try this one. Suzuki frowned down at the much shorter sword, and then regretfully sheathed it. I'm too used to a dado, sorry. Given that Tensa Zenjutsu was a full katana and thus at least twice the length of the longest wakizashi, the difference in reach was too great to compensate for. His gaze skipped past the rest of the rack. The Chokyudo were totally out. He wouldn't even know what to do with a straight-edged sword when he had only ever used curved-edged katana, and the Tanto met with the same problem as the wakizashi. What are those? He wondered, pointing at the rack half hidden behind Yoruichi. She glanced behind her. These are the polearms. She stepped aside, introducing them type by type. The Nagamaki with straight blades, the Naginata with curved blades, and there's a few Yari, the spears. He moved closer, thoughtfully. This isn't a polearm, he pointed out, lifting up one of the bladed weapons that first caught his eye. It looked like a katana at first glance, but there must be a reason it was in the Naginata section instead. He frowned, unsheathing the weapon for a better look. The blade portion was much wider and had a greater curvature, very different from the katana he was used to seeing. In fact, he glanced at the other Naginata on the rack. Yes, the blade resembled that of a Naginata, though the hilt was definitely that of a katana. It's a Naginata Neashi, a Naginata blade that has been reshaped into a katana. Suzuki gave an absent nod to indicate that he had heard, settling into a basic stance with the weapon. The blade reminded him a little of Zenjutsu's Kyber knife Shikai form, wide and seemingly unwieldy. The Naginata Neashi was heavier than that katana he'd tried, too, and much closer to what Tensa Zenjutsu had been like. It still wasn't a perfect fit, but it would do in a pinch. I'll take it, he told the 2 females, sheathing it with a smooth motion and swinging it over his back to test the weight. It wasn't quite Zenjutsu, but it would do. Great. Yoruichi beamed brightly, and led him over to the shelves. We can skip the climbing equipment, I think. Armor would just slow you down. That last sentence was directed towards Matsuoka, who had approached carrying several pieces lined with chain armor. Yoruichi picked up the hooded cloak off the pile and waved off the rest. Not even the shin and arm guards, Yoruichi-sama. Yoruichi frowned thoughtfully, and then looked at Suzuki. Well, do you think you need them? His first instinct was a resounding no, but then he reconsidered the fact that the majority of his Ryatsu was out of his reach, locked down by a Ryatsu dampener. Having them won't hurt, I suppose, he finally said grudgingly. All right, a pair of shin guards and another pair of arm guards then. Yoruichi added those to the growing pile in her arms and waved Matsuoka off. Meanwhile, any concealable weapon catch your fancy. Suzuki stared at the selection. There were neat rows of chained weapons like the Kusarigama and the Nunchaku. The former had been Kiritsuchi Mayuri's preferred weapon. The latter was clearly the form Ikaku's Shikai had taken. On the next shelf lay concealable bladed weapons like small daggers, sets of claws, and sai, 3-pronged batons. None of them were weapons he knew how to use, and so he moved on. The next rack of shelves caught his interest. At first sight it appeared to be filled with rows upon rows of pebbles, but Yoruichi stopped him before he could pick one up. Different types of explosives, she explained succinctly, and these egg-shaped ones are filled with blinding powder, not something you want to set off by accident. Further to the right hung several short bows from the wall, with matching quivers of arrows. Suzuki carefully sidestepped the giant container with the kanji for poison on it, and returned to the last rack of shelves. The top shelf was dominated by blowguns longer than some of the daggers he'd seen. A stack of darts next to them topped by a handwritten note that proclaimed poisonous in large words, followed by illegible scribbles of presumably the exact type of poison used. The next shelf held an array of shuriken, different kinds of thrown weapons. Suzuki pursed his lips and reached for several of the unfletched iron darts. It probably wouldn't hurt to try. He straightened, one of the darts loosely pinched between index and middle finger, drew back his arm, and let it fly towards one of the targets on the wall. It struck the rock wall with a loud ping, and clattered to the ground. Yoruichi whistled. "Try the rest?" she asked, indicating the other 4 targets on the wall. Suzuki stepped away from the shelves just in case, making sure he was nowhere near that vat of poison, and twirled the next dart between his fingers. It left his hand with a little dash of ryatsu, and this time instead of falling to the floor, it buried itself within the rock with a loud grinding noise. The next 3 found their targets just as swiftly, tearing through the paper like a hot knife through butter, and embedding themselves halfway into the wall. 5 targets now hung on the wall, 4 of them nailed to the rock through the dead center. Matsuoka made a choked noise of shock, moving to the wall to inspect each of them in turn, including the 5th, which sported a hole in its center. "Interesting," was Yoruichi's only comment, and then, "Take 2 full sleeves, 1 for each arm." Suzuki did so, and she showed him how to buckle them on, how to tuck them under the arm guards, and how to twitch his ryatsu in such a way as to slide the darts one by one into his hand. "Tell Kisuke about them on the way," she whispered into his ear while tightening the arm guards such that they fit snugly against his arm without feeling like they were strangling his circulation. To his surprise, they were light, far lighter than he'd expected metal plates to be, and not at all cumbersome when he experimentally tried to swing his new sword with them on. "Right," Yoruichi muttered, ushering him out of the storeroom. "It's almost time. Kisuke's probably already waiting." The blonde was, indeed, already standing to one side when the 2 of them arrived at the west exit. Suzuki was really going to need a map to find his way around, preferably one that was color-coded. He nodded his thanks when Yoruichi tossed him the other equipment pouch, attaching it to his utility belt. "This is a 3-fold Class S mission," summarized Yoruichi. "First, get the rest of Yushiro's team out of there. This is far beyond their capabilities. Next, gather all the information you have on this smuggling ring. Who their sponsors are, do they have any competitors? You know the drill, Kisuke. Last but not least, either recover the missing 6 members, or learn of their locations if you deem retrieval impossible. You're the team leader, Kisuke. Check in at least once a week, and try not to lose your 2 ducklings." All right. They didn't take the gates. In fact, they avoided the towns altogether, 2 barely noticeable shadows under the darkened canopy of the forests that gave Junran its name. The former shopkeeper set a grueling pace, not so fast that Suzuki couldn't keep up, of course, but enough that he had to pay a requisite amount of attention to his surroundings so as to avoid running headfirst into a tree. He was glad, now, that Yoruichi had given him a quick briefing on the way. Shiho and Yushiro had left 10 hours ago with a standard 6-man team. It being an outer Rukangai mission, every member of the team was at least at junior seated officer level. This meant that they were approximately 20 districts ahead, but there was every chance that they would make camp for the night before crossing into far more dangerous outer Rukangai. They were aiming to catch them before daybreak. The shadow that he had been absently trailing leapt upwards, suddenly, and Suzuki's first instinct was to put his back to the nearest tree, one hand going to the hilt of the weapon strapped to his back. "Stand down." It took him embarrassingly long to realize the pool of shadow a few meters ahead of them wasn't a very big tree, but instead the silhouette of a towering wall. They had reached the edge of Junranon. He looked up just in time to see Kisuke spring from the branch he had been perched on, vanishing from his view. Suzuki flashed to the edge of the trees to see the blonde swing himself effortlessly up onto the wall, and pause there in a crouch. He couldn't be sure in the dim light, but he thought Kisuke turned his head to look in his direction. Suzuki craned his neck upwards, mentally estimating the height of the wall. Then he took a few steps backwards to give himself a running start, and jumped. One hand slapped painfully onto the unyielding stone, but the other found just sufficient purchase in a crevice Just a split second for him to get his feet under himself and kick off a slight protrusion in the rock with his toes. His arms cleared the top of the wall this time, and he quickly hauled himself up, blushing hotly as he sneaked a glance in Kisuke's direction. The blonde tilted his head, the hair falling over his eyes casting them into deeper shadow, but there was no hiding the amused quirk of his lips. Still, he was close enough and stationary that it only took Suzuki a second of fumbling to find Kisuke's spirit ribbon. "Shut up, Ma, Suzuki-san, I haven't even said anything yet." The ghost of a paper fan snapping open taunted him, and for a moment he almost expected to see Kisuke whip out his omnipresent fan. Except, of course, it was all in his head. Suzuki clutched at the spirit ribbon, out of the very real concern that he wouldn't be able to find it again while they were moving. Even as he was twining a few strands of his own Ryatsu around it for good measure, he could feel the ribbon fading in and out of his senses, as though it could disappear any moment. Kisuke glanced sideways at him, and for a moment he seemed as though he wanted to say something. Then that moment passed, and he sprung off the wall, landing without a single rustle in the grass far below. "Let's go." Dawn was breaking when Kisuke finally slowed, head cocked to the side as though there was a sound only he could hear. Then, without speaking, he veered sharply off the path, vaulting over a clump of bushes in the way. Before Suzuki could so much as correct his own course, things shot out of the bushes, headed straight for both of them. Kisuke twisted his body in midair, kicking off a branch to avoid the attacks. Suzuki ducked under the spray of projectiles, one hand on his weapon, the other ready with a return volley of his own. "Hold your fire, Urahara Senseki," gasped the bush. Kisuke gave a terse nod, as though it was every day he conversed with the passing foliage. "I need to speak to Yushiro-san." The bushes shook, and then a head popped up to reveal a young man, absently dusting a few stray leaves out of his hair. His eyes were bright with curiosity, but he refrained from questioning them. "Camp is this way." He led them deeper into the forest, until several bedrolls were clearly visible on the forest floor, cleverly camouflaged amongst the foliage. Yushiro twitched in his sleep as they came closer, and then his eyes blinked open. "I thought I felt your presence, Kisuke-san." He yawned, rubbing his eyes blearily, and sat up. "What happened?" "Fresh intel came in while you were away," Kisuke told him succinctly, squatting down next to his bedroll. "We're reclassifying this mission." Yushiro's hand dropped into his lap and he suddenly looked wide awake. His eyes swept across the rest of his squad, who were now sluggishly rolling out of their own bedrolls. Everyone. He didn't audibly raise his voice, but it projected across the camp nonetheless. "We have a change of mission parameters." He nodded to the blonde, who stood up and began scaling the nearest tree. "This mission is now Class S, so all of you are dismissed." The camp came awake in a matter of moments, the other 5 squad members packing up quickly and efficiently. More than one glanced in confusion at Yushiro or Suzuki, but none ventured a question. On his part, Yushiro personally thanked each of them for coming so far, and assured them that they had the next few days off just as if they'd returned from a full-length mission. Only when the last person was out of earshot did Yushiro continue, gaze open and inquisitive. "Suzuki-san, right." Suzuki made a little bow, as one equal to another. "Yes, please take care of me." Yushiro laughed ruefully, a high clear sound, for the first time sounding like the child he looked like. "I can hardly presume thus. Instead, please do take care of me." He picked up his own backpack, hoisting it easily over a shoulder despite the fact that it rose a good height above his head, and Suzuki was sharply reminded of the fact that although he resembled a child in appearance, this was Yorwich's younger brother. Then Yushiro turned to Kisuke, who was climbing down from the tree. "What happened?" The blonde dropped the last few meters to the ground and began picking his way through the trees. Suzuki assumed that he had been checking the direction of the sun, which was almost hidden by the canopy above them. "There's apparently a smuggling syndicate active in North District 53, operating out of the Shinigami outpost. We suspect that the missing squad was detained by them." The boy made a sound of comprehension. "They're well connected and well armed, aren't they?" It wasn't a question, and the silence was a sufficient answer. "Well then, lead on, team leader." His voice was light, but his face held no trace of humor. "Let's show them why they shouldn't take the Onmitsukido so lightly." "Suzuki-san, what's your weapon of choice?" After the hours of silence, it took Suzuki a few moments to realize that Yushiro had spoken aloud, and another embarrassing moment before he belatedly realized that the boy was addressing him. "Well," he fumbled, "I've got a Naginata Neashi." He indicated the sword strapped to his back, and 2 sleeves of throwing darts. Yushiro eyed his back shrewdly, a faint crease in his brow. "That's not your Zanpakuto, is it?" "No," agreed Suzuki. After spending 4 years in a state of permanent shikai, He was feeling a little naked with just a plain sword, but he could make do. "Forgive me, but I wonder why Nisama chose to send you on a Class S for your first mission." Yushiro tilted his head while running, violet hair flying across his face. "Did something happen at the compound?" "Oh," he said intelligently. To be honest, he didn't know why Yoruichi had sent him away either. She couldn't still be angry about that time when those boys invaded his room, could she? That was last week. It didn't escape his notice either that the other two members on the mission were both corps commanders, so either Kisuke believed Suzuki to be at that level even without his Zanpakuto, or he believed he could compensate for Suzuki if necessary. Seishin has made an offer of mentorship for Suzuki, Yoruichi-san, and I believed it was prudent to get him out as soon as possible. Hearing Kisuke's voice float back to them, Yushiro hissed in something that might have been shock or horror. Or maybe, Suzuki reflected ruefully, the situation was far more dire than he'd expected it to be. As though reading his mind, Kisuke added almost cheerfully, "Besides, he managed to defeat Katsuo-san without his Zanpakuto, so I think he'll be fine." He held up a hand. "The border of District 50 is just ahead. We'll camp here for the night. Middle of the woods, check. Derelict mansion, check. Guards patrolling the perimeter, check." This was it, then. At a single gesture, they circled once around the compound, Kisuke silently pointing out all the entryways and potential escape routes. They then set up camp in a small clearing as close to the compound as they dared, peppering it with Ryatsu concealment wards, one-way noise-canceling wards, and intruder detection wards. His job complete, Kisuke sat down with his back against the trunk of a tree, and within moments his breathing evened out. With 3 of them, they could afford to handle the mission in shifts, such that there was always one person on surveillance, one person awake in the camp, and one person asleep. As discussed the previous night, Kisuke would be taking the late night shift, Yushiro the day shift, and Suzuki the evening shift. Each of them would be spending 4 hours awake, 8 hours on surveillance, another 4 hours awake, and then 8 hours asleep. Suzuki was starting to understand why Yoruichi didn't bother giving him a bedroll. The one Yushiro was carrying was enough for the 3 of them. 3 days later, it was clear that something was wrong. None of them had seen a single person enter or leave the compound, despite their around-the-clock surveillance. Even if they assumed that Kisuke had witnessed some abnormally high traffic, the lack of activity was suspicious. After a brief discussion, it was determined that they would have to infiltrate the compound to figure out what was going on. Doing so in the latter half of the night, when the patrolling guards were the most worn out, seemed to be the most sensible option. Getting it almost seemed too simple, in Suzuki's opinion. Then again, his opinion might be a little skewed, given that the sort of places he was used to infiltrating were more along the lines of Serete, Lost Notches, and the Soul King's Palace. Compared to those, he supposed that a simple Shinigami outpost, whether it was home to a criminal syndicate or not, would seem laughably easy. The corridors, painted a sterile white, were devoid of any signs of life. They'd entered through an open window into some kind of abandoned sitting room on the 3rd floor, bypassing most of the potential security, assuming, of course, that the leaders of this operation wouldn't want a bunch of thugs near sensitive information. But even then, the complete lack of guards set Suzuki's teeth on edge. Since this was a Shinigami outpost, they were operating under the assumption that there were Ryatsu sensors around, which meant they had to rely on natural physique instead of Ryatsu enhancements. Suzuki was glad that most of his Ryatsu was currently suppressed and out of reach. There was no way he could have hidden all of it on his own. He was equally glad for the fact that Kisuke, who was leading the way, seemed to have some preternatural method of picking out the floorboards that wouldn't creak under their weight, and so all they had to do was follow his lead. There was a single door at the end of the corridor. Despite the lack of light shining through the paper door panel, Kisuke held up a hand and paused at the doorway, pressing his ear to the thin wooden frame. On the other side of the door, Yushiro did the same, then shook his head once. There was no sound coming from inside the room. At a gesture, Suzuki let a throwing dart fall into each hand, readying himself to react at the slightest hint of movement. Slowly, the 2 of them eased the door open, careful not to knock the sliding panel against the frame. Suzuki kept his eyes peeled, but the room was still and devoid of life. Kisuke waited until he was sure he had Suzuki's attention, and then made a very obvious once-over of the room, first tilting his head upwards to scan the ceiling thoroughly, then sweeping the room from left to right and back again, and finally examining every inch of the floor. Only then did he set foot over the threshold. Even then, they couldn't be certain the room was as empty as it appeared. A huge ornate desk dominated the room, dwarfing the high-backed throne behind it. The moonlight shone through large windows covered entirely with decorative metal inlays, forming deep pools of shadows on the floor. What caught Suzuki's attention was the cabinets lining one wall. Upon closer inspection, they were stuffed full of papers, but none of them were labeled. He was about to pull out a folder to check its contents when he heard the door slide shut with a soft click. Suzuki whirled around, a throwing dart at the ready, only to see Yushiro step away from the door. Yorwitch's younger brother gave him an odd look, crossing over to the opposite end of the room. Only then did Suzuki realize there was another door, slightly ajar, and that Kisuke was nowhere in sight. In the other room was, apparently, a bedroom of some sort. The futon was laid out but empty, which was odd for this time of the night. But what caught his eye was the closet running along one wall. The doors were open, revealing rows of richly embroidered kimonos. Suzuki frowned. What noblewoman would frequent such a place? Movement in the depths of the closet caught his eye, and Suzuki tensed again, only to relax a moment later when blonde hair came into view. He frowned. Kisuke looked vaguely discomfited, and he made some jerky gestures to Yushiro, who very visible startled in surprise. Before he could ask either of them to explain what was going on, though, all three of their heads snapped to the ajar door. There was the sound of running footsteps coming down the corridor. Suzuki took 2 instinctive steps forwards before realizing there was no other way out. In that time, Yushiro had quietly slid the door separating the bedroom from the office shut, and Kisuke had an arm around Suzuki's chest and was pulling him insistently towards the closet. Then a warm palm clamped itself over Suzuki's mouth, and he was shoved into a pile of fabric. He wanted to protest. He wasn't an idiot. He hadn't made a sound the entire time. Why didn't they trust him to keep quiet? But then it hit him. The cloying smell of blood. Suzuki was glad for the hand sealed over his mouth then, for he would have gasped aloud in shock had Kisuke not preemptively cut off his air supply. Even then, it took him a few moments to relax the death grip he had on Kisuke's forearm, an instinctive reaction to being effectively choked. Immediately, the hand around his mouth slackened, letting him cautiously suck in a lungful of air, trying not to wheeze. He couldn't see anything in the pitch darkness of the closet. Yushiro, whom Suzuki could feel pressed up against his back, must have closed the door while he was preoccupied, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. For the smell of blood to still be so strong meant the body had yet to dissolve into Reishi. In other words, the death had occurred within the past day or so. Suzuki hadn't seen any signs of blood on the bedroom floor, but it had been too dark to see much. Bodies littered the ground, enemies and allies alike. The scent of blood thick in the air. He took a huge gulp of air, glad that Kisuke's hand was still resting loosely over his mouth, trying to get rid of the phantom taste of blood in his mouth. The line of Yushiro's body was a hot brand against his back, and he consciously tried to relax, letting the 2 points of contact anchor him to the present. A crash in the next room made him jump. Well, if the newcomer wanted their attention, he had it. He certainly wasn't trying to be quiet, now that Suzuki was concentrating his surroundings. Another crash sounded, followed by the unmistakable rustling of papers. Then, the sound of footsteps fading into the distance down the corridor, accompanied by the occasional squeak of the floorboards. The closet door was flung open unceremoniously, and Kisuke half-dragged Suzuki out into the office area, pushing him down insistently until he was sitting on the floor and pressing his head down between his knees. Suzuki took a few more gulps of air and then raised his head blearily to see the other two squatting. Well, Kisuke squatting, Yushiro kneeling in Seiza by the piles of paper strewn all across the office floor, skimming through their contents. And then the door slid open again, catching all three of them by surprise. Yushiro, who had his back to the door, immediately dropped into a forward roll across the papers, and not a moment too soon, for a blade plunged directly down where he had been a moment ago, quivering slightly in the wooden floorboards. Suzuki flung himself sideways as the newcomer's attention turned to him next, narrowly evading a thin projectile of some sort. His shoulder smashed into the desk, and he bit back a cry of pain, righting himself just in time to see Kisuke spring for the intruder, a glint of metal in his hand. The knife was knocked out of Kisuke's hand by a harsh chop, and the former shopkeeper didn't bother trying to pick it up, instead grabbing the outstretched wrist and twisting it sharply to the side. His opponent went with the flow, allowing himself to be flipped upside down, but then diverted Kisuke's kick with an open-palmed smack to the knee, and Kisuke had to let go to avoid the legs threatening to wrap around his neck. They both backed up a step, assessing each other, and then leapt at the same time. There was no way Suzuki could do anything to help without running the risk of hitting Kisuke by accident. They were ducking and swerving around each other far too fast for him to get a solid bead on the hooded assassin. Across the room, Yushiro evidently thought the same, for he was crouched in a ready position but otherwise motionless. Their eyes met in mutual understanding, and both of them turned their attention to the fierce hand-to-hand in the middle of the room, ready to pounce on the first opportunity. Finally, Kisuke managed to get the other into a chokehold with both hands, until the other assassin went limp in his grip. He held on a moment longer just to be sure, and then let go to check for a pulse. Without opening his eyes, the assassin drew up both his legs and kicked Kisuke directly in the sternum. Caught completely off guard, the blonde went flying, and Suzuki winced at the sickening thump of flesh against the wall. But he had already fired the moment Kisuke was no longer within his range, two bow shuriken whistling through the air to their intended target. The assassin yanked out a knife from nowhere and managed to parry the first one, but the second caught him in the arm, and the third, hidden in the shadow of the first two, helped along by the dim lighting in the room, lodged itself in his shoulder. And then Yushiro was on him, holding a knife to his neck. Taking the chance, Suzuki unsheathed his Naginata Naoshi, settling into a ready stance just in case the assassin tried anything. He needn't have worried. There was a quiet click, a hiss, and Yushiro had to leap backwards as the assassin's body burst into flames. Suzuki and Yushiro exchanged a mutual glance of horror as his clothes caught fire far too quickly to be put out, right before the hood fell off. Hateful eyes glared back at them from the face of a young woman, a moment before it too was swallowed by the flames. Uttering a sharp curse, the first time any of them had spoken the entire time, Yushiro dropped onto his knees and began sweeping all the papers scattered over the floor into his arms. A moment later, Suzuki belatedly realized why the fire wasn't stopping, and the floor was made of wood. Kisuke clambered unsteadily to his feet with a nearly inaudible groan over the crackle of the fire, and started pulling the nearest folders from the cabinets. Suzuki sprang forwards to help, sweeping the files off the shelves into Yushiro's arms, and then an arm was tugging him insistently away from the last shelf, pulling him out of the room. Suzuki coughed harshly, eyes watering, only then realizing that the office was full of smoke and that Yushiro was already ahead of them, laden down with a tower of files taller than he was. He glanced back to see Kisuke yanking on the last shelf, physically ripping the wooden construct out together with all the folders. No point in concealing their Ryatsu any further, he supposed, since stealth was clearly no longer an option, and leaping over the tongues of flames to reach the doorway. They sped down the corridor to the stairs at the far end, taking them three at a time. Despite the fire nipping at their heels, they encountered no one else until they reached the first floor, where they were greeted by the sight of dead bodies strewn carelessly over the ground, clad in the uniform of the guards. The assassin had clearly not left any eyewitnesses. At the foot of the stairs laid the face-down body of a portly male, hair graying at his temples, one hand outstretched as though in entreaty. Probably the one who had interrupted them the first time, Suzuki surmised. Yushiro kicked him over with one foot, and then shook his head. He didn't recognize the man. Then there was no time for thinking as they burst out of the compound, stopping just outside the enclosure just in time to watch the entire building go up in flames. Kisuke frowned contemplatively, but Suzuki couldn't feel a sense of urgency emanating from him, and then he realized why. There was a ring of bare earth, about several dozen people wide, all around the mansion. The fire wouldn't be able to spread to the rest of the forest. Nevertheless, they stood and watched just to make sure, until the flames died down to mere embers. Only then did they make a beeline for the clearing where they had left the rest of their belongings. Suzuki dropped his armful of folders on the ground with a thankful groan, and stared at the small mountain in vague dismay. How were they going to find anything useful in that mess? Undeterred, Kisuke picked up the first folder atop the pile and opened it, or tried to, anyway. There was a soft buzzing sound, and the blonde dropped the folder right before an arc of electricity danced over it. The three of them exchanged looks, Suzuki slowly putting down the folder he was about to open. Then Kisuke picked the fallen folder off the ground, turning it this way, and that, and then showed the two of them a tiny seal inscribed into the edge of the folder. "I think," he said very slowly, completely foregoing radio silence, "we have a problem." Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And comment down your opinion on this video. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.